Well, thanks for sticking around and clicking on video 2 for learning outcomes. So those Bloom's taxonomy images are great, but they're really geared toward classroom and more traditional academic experiences. One of the things that we have to think about is how do we convert those to out-of-class learning experiences? We need to think about what students are producing through their experiences, and it's not as easy as what students might submit for class assignments. So one of the things then that gets me thinking about the student experience side, the out-of-class learning experiences or the co-curriculum, is thinking in terms of goals. And there are ways to think about outcome statements in terms of goals. So when I was in undergrad as a student leader, I was introduced to this perspective of SMART goals. And you've probably seen SMART goals before, but in case you haven't, here they are. SMART goals should be specific, they should be measurable, they should be attainable, they should be results focused, and they should be tailored specifically to the individual program or service. And so let's start at the beginning. Whether we're writing SMART goals or writing other types of learning outcome statements through one of the formula approaches, whatever it is, we need to know a couple of things. First and foremost, what does my program or process do? So maybe I work with student leadership programs, and so my program provides student leadership training and resources for student leaders. Great. Maybe I work in the Office of Financial Aid. And one of the things that we want to be able to assess is not so much student learning, although there are things to assess from a learning perspective in student financial aid. But one of the things that financial aid offices get slammed for is inefficiency. And if I worked in financial aid, I would want to have outcome statements that provide a means for our department to think about and assess our processes. So what do the various processes do that we ask students to complete when it comes to financial aid? And then maybe a second question that we need to ask ourselves is, why does the program or the service or the process exist? And that can be a tough question to answer sometimes. I think we focus so much on the what and sometimes the how. So what do we do and how do we do it? That I don't know if we spend a lot of time thinking about why. Why does our office exist? Why does our program exist? And a lot of times when people try to go through a process of answering that second question, it ends up becoming, well, a response framed in the how and the what, but still not the why. If we can't understand the why, how can we expect students or other stakeholders to understand the why? So that's something really important to think about as we frame assessment practices, as we frame our assessment efforts. Getting at that why question and an answer to it can help provide a little bit of momentum for writing outcome statements. So one of the other things that we need to determine when we're thinking through outcome statements are answers to a few other questions as well. And so this is something that goes kind of speaking back to last week when looking at assessment planning, is that we need to make sure that we know why we're doing any particular assessment activity. We need to know kind of who is this for? Do we want the results because we are satisfying some external accreditation requirement? Are we driven to conduct the assessment because we want to maintain a perspective on continuous quality improvement? Are we satisfying a demand from a vice president or a president? Are we participating because we're part of a professional network and we have peer institutions participating? And I'm not going to say that one of those questions is better than the other, although I've alluded to the fact as we began this course that ideally we have our eye on continuous improvement, that's what drives our assessment efforts. But I think it's a naive statement or a naive perspective to think that's going to be the only driver of assessment efforts. That hopefully it's a combination of at least a couple of those things that I listed. More likely than not, though, it's probably our assessment efforts are likely driven from external demands. So we need to make sure that we keep that in mind as we think about answering that question of why do we do what we do? Why does our office exist? And who are we serving? So that when we're writing learning outcomes, maybe that's the opportunity we have to really put focus on getting at that why question and trying to get answers to the other question that was on the previous slide of what does my program or what does this process do? Now, when writing learning outcomes, we might not have in our mind aspects of follow-up. But that's something to think about as we look at learning outcomes, not necessarily as each individual outcome, but as a set of outcome statements that we're assessing over a period of time as part of an overarching assessment cycle. We have to think about what is that cycle. Is there a progression in the learning outcomes? Does an answer to one learning outcome require information from a previous learning outcome? And of course, we always need to think about the decision-making process and that cycle as well. So I mentioned in the previous video that I posed a question on Twitter to colleagues asking for their thoughts on learning outcomes, and I shared one already from Bob Alston, but I want to share a couple of thoughts from some other folks as well. So Gavin Henning, who is the outgoing president or immediate past president of ACPA College Student Educators International. Gavin is also a faculty member at New England College and has written a couple of books on assessment. And so Gavin was nice enough to share one of his thoughts is that it's really important to make sure to focus on the action verb. That if we get that verb wrong, or if we don't think critically enough about that verb, then our whole outcome statement is a wash. And Mallory Bauer, who is at SUNY Oswego, I believe, works in career services and suggested looking at NACE's outcomes that they look for that employers look for in college graduates. And so this is a snapshot from the latest NACE study, and we see that there are some pretty strong indicators of things that we do in the co-curriculum that we help students develop from the administrative or student support side of the house. So we see things like leadership and teamwork and communication skills and problem solving. These are things that we can help students develop, that we can build into our learning outcomes for virtually any student experience on a college campus. So if you're working with a program or service and you're trying to figure out, wow, how can we make sure that our learning outcomes are really driving students in a way that to an outcome that's meaningful for them and connects to some sort of real world application, take a look at the NACE results each year. And I got to tell you, the last probably 5 years or so, these results have not changed that much. There's been a little bit of back and forth on a couple of them, but it's been pretty consistent. So that's a good tool to have and a good tool to look at. And I'll post a link to the NACE website on Canvas. So TJ Willis, and I actually forget where TJ Willis works right now. I don't want to speak incorrectly, because if I get it wrong and you go looking for him, who knows, maybe you won't be able to find him. But I really like what TJ says here, is don't get too caught up in the process or whatever a given format is for writing learning outcomes. That sometimes we are kind of forced into a particular format or approach to outcomes because of the way that they're expected for measuring or reporting, rather than looking at measuring what we actually do. And then he continued to say that he often sees learning outcomes dumbed down so that they can be reported easier, which really kind of it compounds one of the issues that we see with assessment work, is that assessment becomes this something extra rather than something that is simply infused in part of our daily work in the field. And so that a lot of what TJ is saying in this statement, I think, connects back to when we looked at the idea of building a culture of assessment in week 2. So I made reference to formative and summative assessments, and we can structure learning outcomes in ways to point to whether it's a formative assessment or a summative assessment. And again, I mentioned those in the video in week 4. And so just going to wrap up with this visual about summative assessments versus formative assessments, or not this video, this image. And that's when we focus solely on the end result of an experience and assessing at that point, we're only getting a little piece. And so I like the analogy to the iceberg, that only 10% of an iceberg is actually visible above the surface, and that the 90% is really what we should be paying attention to when looking at icebergs. And the same thing goes to assessing student experiences, that we need to be focusing much more of our attention on what's happening during the experience rather than simply looking at what is the desired outcome at the very end.